All right, good morning, everyone. We're not exactly packing the pews for our committee meeting on the independent audit from last fiscal year, but I do appreciate everyone being here. I'm joined at the table by Councilors Hogan, Jones-Rouser, Nave, and Paniagua. And also sitting at the table are our auditors from Bonadillo. And gentlemen, as we discussed on the way in, there was a very rapid turnaround between issuance and this committee meeting. I've had an opportunity to have a quick high-level overview, but haven't really gone into detail. I don't want to speak on behalf of my fellow counselors, but if you could, work through it as if we have not gone into the detail of the report, that would be wonderful. Thank you. The water down.
Here's your Okay, so I am Greg Evans. I am the audit partner on the engagement. With me is Jacob Skevel. Jake is our principal and handles most of the oversight over the field work. So we are here to discuss June 30, 2024, which of course is not ideal. As we are getting close to year end for 2025. So we'll talk about some of the reasons that we're here at this point. Your reports are due to the federal government today, and we are going to meet that deadline. Everything's queued up and ready to go, waiting for Mike to go in and approve that submission. So in that respect, we're good in terms of deadlines. So what you have in front of you is a summary of the large stack of documents that you received. So we'll work through that. Just a little bit easier than fumbling through, 110-page financial statement or whatever that is. That being said, so our agenda for today. We're going to go over the scope of services. We're going to go over an executive summary, which is going to detail some of those audit results. We're going to talk about some of what we think are the key financial highlights that are in there. We're going to go over the audit findings. We did have some findings this year. And we're going to talk about an upcoming pronouncement that will have a bit of an effect on the financial statements and our audit work. So moving on to page 4, the scope of services. So what you have in front of you is the audit of the financial statements and the financial statements. You have 2 single audits. You have a federal single audit and a New York State DOT single audit. And you have a management letter. The management letter is basically items that you should be aware of and considered best practices, but those are not findings. But we will go over those findings that I mentioned earlier. Part B, the executive summary. So we always talk about this. The financial statements are yours. Our job is to give an opinion on those financial statements. Our opinion is we believe they're fairly stated in all material respects. Moved on to page 6, sorry. We talk about an unmodified opinion, but actually there's many opinions in there. We give an opinion on each of your funds, your governmental activities, your business type activities. So, I don't know, there's probably, 7 or 8 opinions in there?
Yep, at least.
So, but the good news is they're all unmodified. So, had we come in and we proposed journal entries that, Mike or management didn't agree with, we would have a different opinion. Fortunately, we all agreed on those adjustments, and we'll talk about some of those too. So one thing we do is we review your internal controls over financial reporting, and again, that's where those findings are going to come in. We look to see that your internal controls are designed properly and operating as designed. Typically, when we have adjustments to your financial statements, we will have a material weakness, and we do have that material weakness because we did propose several audit adjustments. And again, Jake's going to go over those in a little bit. I just mentioned that we do have some audit adjustments that we'll talk about. Some of the difficulties encountered in performing the audit, and why we're here on March 31st as opposed to December 31st or January 31st. Certainly, that's a huge document. That's a heavy lift for the Bureau of Accounts to provide all the information that needs to get in there and for us to audit that. That's a lot of what's going on here. In particular, the CFA, which is the Schedule of Expenditures of Federal Awards, we did not have a final number on that until December 11th. So well into where, we would have anticipated completing the audit, we were still getting changes to those numbers on the federal awards. So, and what that means is we audited 5 federal programs, and it's all based on those numbers. So for us to get to mid-December and not know exactly what those numbers are meant we could have had to audit an extra program, or we might have been auditing a program that we shouldn't have been auditing. So that's sort of the significance of not having those numbers when we start in October, is there's a lot of planning that has to go into that federal audit in particular. So that was kind of the major slowdown this year, and I know Mike got pulled away at some point in time during the audit for some other issues that were happening here at the city. So in terms of single audit compliance, so again, related to those federal awards, we did have a finding that caused us to modify our opinion on compliance. And I'll preface this by saying every federal program has a list of compliance requirements that we have to audit. And again, we give an opinion on each one of those compliance requirements. So in reality, if we had 5 programs and they had 6 compliance requirements, we were really giving 30 opinions there. So for 29 out of those 30, we have an unmodified opinion, but for the Home Investment Partnerships Program, we did feel that there was a material non-compliance that we'll discuss in a little bit. We did have some internal control findings over those federal award programs, and we'll talk about those too. So there's 2 types of audits related to the federal awards. There's the compliance audit, and then there's the internal control over compliance. So all of this is, I'm throwing this at you. The reality is, there's a lot that goes into this audit. We spent approximately 1,100 hours on this audit, so that's a lot. That's one of the largest audits that we do. And, we're sort of boiling it down into a 19-page summary. So, and it's hard for all of you to digest that, so we're again trying to hit those high-level points. So, that being said, Part C is the key financial highlights. So, on page 11, I talk about the government-wide financial statement. So, and this is something I bring up every year. We talk about the government-wide as all of the assets and liabilities of the city combined. So that's all of your long-term and short-term liabilities and assets. So the big thing that sort of dominates this number, and it sort of points to the fact that this isn't a really useful financial statement in terms of managing the city, is when we look at OPEB, which is retiree health, that's $764 million. So that's the number that you're going to pay for all active and retired employees for retiree health. So the reality is you don't have a mechanism to fund that. New York State doesn't allow for that at this point in time. So you basically, it's pay as you go for those premiums on an annual basis. So again, to throw that number at you, not super significant at this point in time. But it's worth noting, like, you could compare yourself to other cities just to see, how are we doing in terms of benefits provided for the number of employees you have. So And there's probably 10 pages of footnotes in the back relative to this $700 million number. Okay. So moving on to page 12. So the fund financial statements, a summary of that is here. And basically, we always sort of focus on fund balance. Fund balance is basically your savings, right? You, in your budget, anticipated using $23 million of fund balance to balance the budget. So basically, you were going to take that out of your savings to balance your revenues and expenditures. So what happened during the year was you only used $4 million, though. So you had a $19 million surplus there for the year ending June 2024. We'll also point out there the school district numbers are also included in here. They anticipated using $8 million, and they actually added to fund balance by $35 million. So that's a $43 million swing. And I point this out, and we'll look at this, going forward. But those are significant numbers. And some of what's going on here is, in particular, any investments you have are performing really well. You had an $8 million surplus on that, which, if interest rates continue to stay up, you will continue to earn money on that savings. So it's sort of unprecedented in governments to earn this much money because you're very limited as to what you can invest in, mostly T-bills, CDs, things like that. But certainly they've performed well. That's part of the reason for the surplus there. And then on to the next page, we'll look at that fund balance over the past few years, and you can see that, prior to the pandemic, you were at about $32 million in unassigned fund balance. So unassigned fund balance is truly your savings. So there's nothing attached to that at this point in time. That has grown all the way up to $112 million at the end of 2024. And it's, close to 50%, I think, if I can read this right. Yeah, somewhere around 45 to 50% of your annual expenditures. Historically, the state comptroller's office would like to see you more in the 15 to 20% range. So, and we know that things are going to change, right? So moving on to the next page, we can see, again, revenues climbing, expenditures climbing over the years. We know, though, and I'll just keep going right on to page 15, we know that federal funds and probably some of your state funds are going to start to tail off. Just in looking at 22 to 23 to 24, you see that downward spiral there. Certainly the ARPA funds were a huge shot in the arm for the city over the past few years. We're, I think, coming to the end of that. You do have till the end of 2026 to expend the rest of those dollars, but certainly there's not going to be more of that available. And arguably, we're not sure what's going to happen at the federal level in terms of additional funds that will be available. So that being said, it's great that you have that fund balance now, but we have to think about what's going to happen in the future in terms of your expenditures are likely not going to come down, but your revenues certainly will. So you will have the opportunity to use that fund balance, and will likely need to in going forward with your budgets. Any questions about the numbers before we get into the findings? And I know this is, it's not ideal to have this conversation March 31st, 9 months after year end.
So that's where my thoughts are going. Mike, do you know what our projected draw from the fund balance will be for the upcoming year? I don't know if based upon the mid-year and then projecting to
fiscal
end of
year 25, we're looking at somewhere between, like $15-16 million.
Okay. Thank you. Already there's a change.
Any other questions about the numbers before we move into the findings? Okay, we'll turn it over to Jake.
All right, so starting on findings for the audit, First off, we have findings in relation to internal controls over financial reporting. So that's really the controls related to how we get to those numbers in the financial statements. The first finding reported on here, we have as a material weakness, which relates to really the material nature of these. So if these audit adjustments were not made, we would have felt that the financial statements were materially misstated. These adjustments were made, which is how we were able to present an unmodified opinion on the statements, but these were detected as part of our audit procedures. So there is a summary of all these adjustments in the required communications letter you have. But just from a big picture, what's in here is there are a lot of journal entries required as part of US GAAP accounting that have to occur after year end. So those financial close and reporting adjustments. Things on the accrual basis of accounting, you have to recognize some changes that are not necessarily just cash transactions. So the couple significant ones we had related, primarily were related to presentation of a workers' comp liability and allocation of those expenditures between funds, an adjustment for interest earned on certificates of deposit, and then some project receivable revenue adjustments, which we have a more specific finding for in a moment. So that's really the big picture, not adjustments related to the ongoing recording of transactions, but some of those year-end close adjustments that need to be made. Next up, finding related to capital projects grants receivable. That was a significant deficiency in internal control. This has been an ongoing thing that has been discussed. The nature of this is there is a very large and complicated spreadsheet that has to be maintained and updated to determine at year end on ongoing projects that receive grant funding how much has been earned and is receivable under those projects. So how much of those current expenditures will be claimed. And that reconciliation process requires this spreadsheet outside of PeopleSoft to come up with those journal entries. In the audit this year, we did not have material adjustments related to this, but we did identify some errors in the reconciliation process. So one of those things that's a very large challenge and a root of what's available in place to come up with those.
Certainly capital projects is one of those areas that's a little bit different than most of your governmental funds because these are projects that again span over years. And you have, I mean, for the most part, your budgets are on an annual basis. So it does take a little bit more, like Jake said, reconciliation to make sure that your revenues are keeping pace with your expenditures on these projects. So a little bit more of a challenge. And I will say that many of our governments struggle with accounting for capital projects.
Next up, we have a finding related to grant management, which is really tied to that similar process of grants supporting these large ongoing projects. What's specifically covered in here is related to state DOT funds. Basically, during the 2024 year end, there was just under $15 million of expenditures related to these projects. And due to some issues in tracking and ensuring compliance on these projects, through year end, the city was only able to determine that $9.8 million of those amounts would actually be able to be successfully claimed from the state.
$5 million is a lot of money.
Yep.
do we have an explanation as to what happened in that process?
I was going to come kind of once Jake went through all the
Okay.
findings, come up afterwards
Okay,
and kind of
great.
address
Thank
every
you.
single one.
So, and just to summarize on that, so typically expenditures would match revenues. Due to the issues in the process, they do not at this point. And there may be additional amounts claimed in the future, but to date, that is what has been able to carve out to claim. And even if the expenditures are able to be supported and claimed, ideally in the control structure, we would like to see it happening timely, especially given, as we've seen, the amount of earnings that can happen on cash balances, a timely nature of getting those reimbursements will provide additional opportunities for that. Next up, we had a significant deficiency in internal control related to the procurement process. Specifically, procurement of professional services. It was noted where there was instances where competitive bidding or request for quote process was waived. That is something that there are instances that is allowable and permissible and may be appropriate. But the finding relates to what we were unable to see in the audit was documentation of evidence for the reasoning for the waiver of that process and the ability to see the appropriate monitoring and oversight of those decisions.
So, like Jake said, there's certainly instances where it's appropriate. From an audit perspective, the way to go about this, though, is to have documentation as to the rationale behind a sole source or an emergency purchase, and then the process that you go through to determine that rationale. So what we think is could be helpful is develop a checklist in terms of that process and what you've done, and that should come over here to council with that request for waiver. We think that will improve the process quite a bit and take out some of that ambiguity as to why some of these contracts are issued.
We had a $10 million why earlier in the year, so I think we have to tighten things up a little bit on that.
What we hear a lot, and I'm just kind of looking for your opinion, we hear, well, we've been working with them before, right? They have historical knowledge of our city and of our processes. How far, how much credibility should we give to that historical knowledge?
I think in some cases that's appropriate, like if you're dealing with a vendor that has specific knowledge over that particular product or service, great. But again, that should be documented. You should know that going into the process. But a lot of times, there's no harm in going out and looking for someone who can do the same thing, right? Yes, is it time consuming? Absolutely, but that's part of the process here. That's part of your process in terms of procurement, so that's really a non-answer. I understand that,
right.
but again, it's the more documentation you can attach to that as to the rationale behind the decision, I think is the key to beefing up those internal controls.
We often, like Councilor Williams said, we often ask and they give us the answer, but you're saying it should be documented, that
Absolutely.
answer should be
Yep.
in all the process, so.
Yeah, I would include, as part of that process, all right, who did you call? What was that process? Did you issue an RFP or an RFQ and, only one person answered? That certainly happens a lot. But to just sort of skip over that process and not document how you got to that waiver request, I think that's, concerning to us as auditors.
Continuing on, we have our finding related to the home program, which Greg alluded to previously. This was the reason for the modified opinion on compliance in the single audit. So this is a compliance and control finding. As we typically say, if there was non-compliance, there must have been a breakdown of controls in order to allow that to happen. Specifically, the compliance requirement this relates to is under the special tests and provisions of the compliance, the Uniform Guidance Compliance Supplement. And this particular compliance requirement relates to inspections of home-assisted rental units. And what we found for 2024 was that this process had just fallen by the wayside and was not currently being actively updated of lists of properties that this must be completed on and maintained in completing those requirements. So this didn't relate to any question costs that we would report under the program because it wasn't related to actual expenditures out the door, but it is called out by the compliance supplement of a compliance requirement the federal government wants us to test. And since it was not fulfilled, that's how we get to that modified opinion. And lastly, our other finding in the single audit related to the highway planning and construction program. This is another item related to the procurement process. And what happened in this one is for 5 of our 42 expenditure selections, they were expenditures related to engineering contracts, and we were not able to view the procurement details of what was reviewed in selecting those vendors. This is one that we saw the process in place in other selections, and really was what I would put under the category of documentation retention issues on these. These expenditures were not material to the program, so that's why we do not have any compliance finding related to this item, but we do think it's significant to call out as a control deficiency to you.
I think that's important to point out. 2 levels of findings: significant deficiency, which is lower; material weakness is more significant. Typically, if we're identifying something as a significant deficiency, it has the potential to get to material weakness. So that's sort of the key there, is you do need corrective action related to those significant deficiencies, so we don't come back next year where the dollars might be larger with a material weakness.
Hi, Council. Mike Kenizar, Commissioner of Finance. So just to go through some of these findings, and want to thank Greg and Jake. They are great partners throughout this external audit. They're really helpful, and we're not always the best clients. So really appreciate all their hard work and guidance. Just a couple other things about I'm the Commissioner of Finance. I'm standing up here talking to you about the audit. Something I just as we're talking about internal control. This is really an audit of the city. This isn't just, what is the finance department doing? What is BOA doing? This is an audit of city operations. So we're talking, water, DPW, police, fire. So it's not just, finance isn't doing their job properly. And I think, from a financial statement, when we say financial statement misstatements, that's, is number right? We're saying this, they're telling me the number should be $1 million. I have, 999,000. Okay, we're close enough. So they're not going to say, you're off $1,000, but that's not a material misstatement. You're just off, $1,000. Internal control is more binary. Internal control is yes or no. It's not, is that a $1,000 difference? If I'm supposed to sign a document by month end, March 31st, did I sign that document? No. Okay, that's a lapse in internal control. You were supposed to do this thing by month end. That's a no. So I just, as far as when we're talking financial misstatements versus internal control misstatements. So, $2 million of, under-recorded expenditures. Primarily, this dealt with workers' comp. We had a change in workers' comp providers from PMA to NCA comp. We had a $600,000 prepayment that we didn't record properly as a prepayment. We had recorded it as an expense. That was really pre-funding claims. Additionally, I think a number of the things that Jake went through as well, there's a grant receivable or a grant revenue issue. We under-recorded some interest income as well, but really, I think about $2 million of this difference is driven by workers' comp. We're not doing great, expenditure testing against our projections. If we were doing that, we should have identified, why haven't any expense? We have hundreds of thousands of dollars of workers' comp expenses hit every month. In January and February 2024, there weren't any. They just weren't. This was a change in the provider. We had a couple months of admin runaround. So this is really truing up those expenses in 2024 for what those workers' comp expenses should have been. And that's finding 001 here. Any questions on that? Moving on to 002, capital projects grants receivable. We have hundreds of ongoing projects at any given time. As Jake mentioned, this is a fairly complicated spreadsheet. I've tried to hand this off to staff. Typically, there are problems. This is something I do myself manually. This past year was particularly challenging. As you were all, I'm sure, very well aware, we had a payroll project that was supposed to go live in October 24, and then it was going to go live in January 25. I'm one person, I'm one resource that took a lot of my time and effort away from the audit that was identified, as a bigger priority to me than the audit was at that time. Capital projects got done in December, got done in January.
I don't know who can field this, but this has been mentioned for a couple of years now, and you mentioned that a lot of municipalities have a hard time with it. Who does it well, and what do they do differently? And I'm not sure who can field that.
It's hard to come up with someone who has it functioning perfectly smoothly.
I think one of the issues here is certainly software related. In an ideal world, all of this happens within your general ledger package. You don't have that happening within PeopleSoft. It has to happen outside of it due to the design of it. Which again, it's I haven't seen a great software package out there, which is crazy to think about, the number of governments we have in this country, and no one has come up with a great software package yet, which kind of blows my mind. But that's part of the problem. But it does. It requires a lot of manual attention, and to Mike's point, at a high level. So he's dealing with that. It's something that's hard for him to pass off. But there's a lot of dollars flowing through there, so it's really important.
I think the other piece of that too, and what ties into the following finding, is this is not a purely mechanical process of you have the expenditures that should match the revenue, just adjust it to match. With a lot of these projects being funded by grants that have their own compliance requirements and ensuring those are met, and then also projects that are funded by multiple sources. So they may have a debt funding component and a grant funding component. So a lot of the information involved in these, when I might review it and follow up with the city team to inquire about discrepancies and things like that, sometimes the answers are very project specific, related to the specific grants and funding and percentages there. So I think that's the other challenge of it, is it requires a lot of specific knowledge on the activity.
Question, competitive bidding process was waived and documentation of approval did not include reasoning for the waiver. Was this a problem we had the previous year?
We had a similar item in the prior year related to the single audit. One of our programs, we had a selection that was specifically a sole source vendor determination. And in that case, there was not documentation for the sole source vendor being selected.
So the administration did not take your recommendation that we have a problem with competitive bidding? Is that correct?
There-
Made it?
It is of a very similar nature.
Okay.
I wouldn't say it's the exact same finding, but similar process.
Yep. And kind of going back to finding 2, what are the repercussions? Is finding 3, is that our repercussion? Potentially missing out on funds, or
Repercussion
what?
is capital projects runs out of money, which like that's what we're running into now. It's just the general fund is loaning money to capital projects because we're spending so much on capital projects without getting the reimbursement. So right now you have a significant due to general fund balance that resides on the capital project fund because we've spent so much money without getting the reimbursement. That would be my opinion of the repercussion. But
Yeah, that, and with finding 1, where we're talking about material audit adjustments, this year when we reviewed capital projects, we had discrepancies. There weren't material issues. It was close enough, but it was indicative that if it's a risk for things going wrong in the
I've never
future.
heard an auditor say close enough, ever in my whole life. I'm just wondering if at some point repercussions with the chaos in Washington DC. I'm just wondering if some of our funders, the state and local, state and federal government would ever say Syracuse has got a real issue here, and we're not going to grant any more money to Syracuse. I mean, can that happen? I'm saying in layman's term, could that possibly happen?
it almost happened last year. I mean, we had to reissue our single audit because we didn't have a grant identified as needed to be on the CFA, the Schedule of Expenditure of Federal Awards, and they were going to pull their funding. So we had to pay Bonadio $5,000 to reissue the CFA to get this number, this one row, on that report. So again, it's, we're setting up a budget in PeopleSoft for these projects. Okay, $500,000 for this. What's funding it? Is it debt? Are we getting a grant for it? Is it ARPA money? Is it cash capital? Oh, let me go check at the ordinance. So let me go check 5 other spreadsheets. So, I mean, depending on where you look, I mean, you could get 5 different answers.
That makes me even more nervous, you saying that you have to be Sherlock Holmes to do
Yeah.
this. I mean, I'm just wondering if, I mean, obviously I go back when we used to have a budget person in every department and all that, and they were somewhat skilled. So we need not only help, but we need skilled help, obviously.
Yeah, no, I think it's improving, standard operating procedures, specifically with our FinOps team, those fiscal officers of, I know working with our new chief administrative officer, one of our goals is to get monthly department reporting. So that would really be your operating budget. So that's the general fund. That's what we're going to be going through in these next couple of weeks. And then really specifically to this finding is grant and project reporting as well. You guys authorize these projects. You guys don't hear about them afterwards. What happened to that $100,000 I approved last year? We, finance, need to, get in front of the departments with better reporting. The challenge there is PeopleSoft. We don't get great reporting out of PeopleSoft. Everything is manual. Everything is downloaded Excel, put in another Excel, put in another Excel. That's difficult to maintain and sustain at the city with our staff.
And to clarify my language, the results of it, there was not a material misstatement related to it.
There you go.
in formal
Clarification.
terms.
So close enough isn't part of the lexicon.
That's not a,
Okay. When I owned the bar, it was close enough a lot of times.
Number 3, really, I mean, that's, number 2 would be the umbrella finding. Number 3 is a little bit more specific, getting into capital projects. This specifically pertains to our CHIPS program, so that's the Consolidated Highway Improvement Program, New York State funding for road reconstruction. Compliance, it's really been the issue here. You need to provide sidewalk corner photos for any work performed. And we have a difficulty cataloging those photos, maintaining those photos. So really, right now, I agree with you, Councilor Williams, $5 million, that's a big number to not get reimbursed if it is eligible for reimbursement. So we have a next claim is May 23rd. As Jake alluded to, really, it's the timeliness of submission. If we spend something, we need to get it reimbursed within 3 months. We can't go more than a quarter without it getting reimbursed. Also, this specific program used to be about a $3.5 million program. Now it's about $15.5 to $16 million annually. We didn't increase staffing. We didn't increase our reporting. We didn't increase anything, but now we're expected to spend $16 million a year just fine. That specifically, deals with those non-compliant CHIPS expenditures. We're probably 12 to 15 months behind on our reimbursement right now. We need to get it to 3. So right now, we're trying to catch up on this reimbursement. I know it's been a multi-departmental effort, API, DPW, finance, as far as improving the reimbursement process. So I'm hoping that, not to say this is going to go away by next year, but I'm hoping this lessens by next year.
And Mike, with that $5 million gap, do you know what we can recoup compared
Maybe
to
everything.
what's already past whatever window?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking potentially $5 million. I mean, millions of dollars. Yeah, and then there's really an 18-month window with CHIPS as well. So really anything that was incurred during calendar year 2024, we need to get included in that May 23rd reimbursement. Number 4, Councilor Nave kind of alluded to. This is, again, I think, this isn't just a finance finding. This is a citywide, finding. What is our process for waiving a competitive bid? I know I've come up here a number of times recently. The Troy Banks audit for a franchise audit, that was a competitive bid. We had Central City Data Services up here a couple months ago. And I think, those are fairly small dollar contracts. But, Central City Data specifically, he had former IT worker here, had intimate knowledge of our operations, of our infrastructure. So something like that, as Greg was talking about, he has that very specific knowledge that maybe that warrants not doing an RFP. There's only one Trevor out there. Whereas some of these more general contracts, especially when we're talking millions of dollars, we should be doing an RFP. Where's our documentation to show us that this contractor has built out or, done this service before? So that's number 4.
Mike, before we move on.
Yep.
From a administrative perspective, what is the time and the cost that goes into issuing an RFP, running through the process?
I have a decent time. It's about 3 months. Cost, that's a little bit more difficult for me to answer. I mean, I would say thousands of dollars. I mean, as far as the staff time and just some of the printing and other, paper processes that go into it. I know we have engaged with OpenGov, so I'm hoping that will kind of standardize the RFP process and just, consistency and make it easier on the respondents' side as well, as far as just a better digital platform. As far as right now, I think if you want to respond to an RFP, you have to provide 9 copies of your response to City Hall. Like, that's ridiculous. We don't need 9 copies. So I think, OpenGov specifically, utilizing technology to try to help address this and standardize, okay, we are doing a waiver. What were the procedures you did that makes, us comfortable, council comfortable, the administration comfortable, that we are getting a competitive price on this, on this item?
Well, commissioners, sometimes you can just do an RFQ, and that involves
Yeah.
some phone calls.
RFQ as well.
That cuts at least we would have a sort of a
Baseline.
Baseline to figure things out,
Agreed. Yeah, and that specific ARPA finding last year, I can't speak to the finding this year as well, but that one was a saltwater installation, and there was one player in town, and they had made half a dozen phone calls, and they just didn't document the phone calls properly. So again, it's that compliance piece, yes or no. Do you have evidence to support this? No, it's a finding. So that's 04. Home investments. Working with our NBD team, I think, you just had a lot of turnover in these historical procedures or processes that were followed. As you had turnover in departments, you've had a loss in that knowledge. They are aware of this finding. They are looking to address it. And I know working with codes, just building a more robust inspection process for any housing that gets this home investment. So that's all I can really speak to as far as the inspections for finding 005. 006, as illustrated in here, 5 of 42. I find it hard to believe that we did not competitively bid for these projects, especially engineering really does a good job here as far as following the book. So this specifically was, we weren't able to provide evidence that these were competitively bid. I think, with the turnover and purchase here, transitioning to better digital tools. If you ask for an RFP from 5 years ago, okay, maybe we have a PDF copy, maybe not. I got to go scan in a copy because it's in a file cabinet. So I think this, having paper transitioning into digital, you're going to have some things that get missed in that process. Whereas going forward, we should have more consistent with our record retention, and yeah, we should have digital, better evidence to provide digital evidence as opposed to. Hopefully, we pulled the right paper out of the file cabinet. So that's my overview of the findings. Any questions, counselors? Thank you.
Certainly, there's a lot here in terms of findings. Don't want to really condemn Mike on this. I think one of the underlying factors here is that Mike does not have enough of those skilled staff people to be able to pull off getting this audit done in a timely manner. Mike is certainly very well versed in all of this. But again, to his point, he said it, he's only one person. So I think that's the root of a lot of this. And it does span across the city. We've had findings for years that, there's things that happen outside of this building and other buildings that, it's just tough to get a handle on, and those grants and things like that aren't under the control of finance. So I think that's something to keep in mind as you go through these reports.
Part E.
E. Oh, yes. Yeah, throw this over to Jake. He's a GASB 101 expert.
Yeah, so not too much right now because this is upcoming pronouncement, so this will be effective for the 2025 financial statements. The impact hasn't been considered yet. But what this has relation to is the estimates for the city's accrual of liability for compensated absences, so sick time, vacation time that have been accrued by employees that has been earned to this point. Something that has been considered in the past as a liability, but the GASB has put out new standards to clarify and try to more unify people's approach to that estimate. So that will be looked at for implementation for the next financial statement.
So it's just another one of those things. It's not going to really change anything about the city's financial position or whatever, but it's not going to make this audit any easier. So unfortunately, the GASB is the standard-setting body that just keeps, changing, right? And every time we make those changes, we have to make an adjustment, and Mike and his team have to make an adjustment. So again, it's important to point out that, this is a complex audit, and it does take time, and it does take a lot of people hours to get this done.
Thank you, Mike, to you and your team, and Bonadio. We appreciate your help.
Yeah, just wanted to thank Bonadio again, and if you are counselors up here working through the statements or any of the other documents, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.
And again, given the quick turnaround, thank you for your availability. So I get a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
you for your time. Yeah, we gotta get rid of them, for sure.
And everyone needs people.
Yeah.
So now we got
Right.
time in between or no? No. That's on there. Oh, my. Well, we can share mine. Oh, but I'm not.
Nobody wants to be an accountant anymore.
Yeah.